Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar. I'm going to give everyone a couple of minutes to join. And while we wait, I would love to know who's in the room. So as usual, I'd be grateful if you could put your name and where you're from in the chat, and we can engage like that. Let's just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join. Welcome everyone who's just joined. We're just going to wait another couple of minutes for everyone to come in to the room. But as usual, I'd love to know who is here. So could you just put your name and where you're from in the chat, and we can just have a squiz. Thank you. Okay. Welcome everyone. I think I'm going to get started because we do have a full, very full hour. But welcome everyone to our, what is it now, many webinars we've had with the ELIFA RECEP and Data Drive webinar series. My name is Elizabeth Girdwood, and I've had the pleasure of facilitating today's webinar, and this is the second time in a row you've heard from me. Although there's a whole team behind me and we share this facilitator role during the series, I put my hand up to facilitate this webinar as I too played a minor role in this wonderful study. And it's so good that it's got to the point of dissemination. So the webinar presents findings from a randomized control trial evaluating a story-based literacy intervention for preschoolers in lower income South African communities, specifically here in the Cape. So the WordWorks Little Stars literacy program centered on storytelling activities to build vocab, phonological awareness, narrative skills, and print concepts. The research was conducted by a team made up of Dr. Shelley O'Carroll, Prof. Delian Klopp, Monique Visser, Annelien Smith, Annika Swart from Stellenbosch University here in the Cape, and then Professor Jane Oakhill from the University of Sussex, and Professor Kate Cain from the University of Lancaster in the United Kingdom. And today, Kate will be presenting the evaluation, and Jane and Shelley are also on hand to field your questions. So we welcome you today, more than 100 of you, and we look forward to hearing your voices as we engage with the effectiveness of a story-based intervention and the importance of early language-rich experiences. As you know, we run a fairly standard format across each webinar. Dr. Cain's presentation will take around 30 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for 20 minutes discussion and fielding of questions. You can submit your questions through the Q&A box, or you can raise your hands, and the technical team will manage your muting and unmuting. But let me start with some housekeeping. We're recording the session, and can everyone please keep your microphones and cameras off to avoid interruptions. We'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, as you know, so please post your questions in the Q&A box whenever they occur. Don't wait for the end. I may ask you to ask your question directly when the time comes, but please be precise and respectful of our very limited, precious time here. This presentation and the recording will be shared after the webinar, so keep an eye out for our socials, on our socials. I'd now like to introduce you to the speaker, Professor Kate Cain. Kate is a distinguished professor of language and literacy in the Department of Psychology at Lancaster University. Her research focuses on language and literacy development and a breakdown from preschool through to adolescence, with a particular focus on understanding the development and the role of language and cognitive skills that support reading comprehension. Over to you, Kate.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm hoping everybody can see my slides okay. Is that all okay?
Perfect, Kate.
Right. Well, as you've heard, a lot of people are involved in making a project like this work. And I've listed just a few of them here on this first slide, but there's obviously a very big team involved. We need to thank our funders, all the children, the teachers, the trainers and the research assistants who made this happen. And here are just some of those fantastic people, part of our team and part of WordWorks, who have supported this project. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing is giving a very brief overview about reading levels in South Africa and why we engaged in evaluating this particular preschool story-based intervention. I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the aims of our work. In the interest of time, I'm not going to be able to go through some of our specific measures, but you're very welcome to ask us questions. And also there's much more detail on the WordWorks website, and I've got a link for that on the final slide. Go through the results, but I should say that this is still very much a work in progress, and we have some very interesting findings and we've got some challenging findings. So we're really looking forward to having your questions and your insight into what we've found so far in this project so we can take that forwards. Okay, so let's just do a little bit of context setting. As I'm sure you're all aware, reading ability is an incredibly important skill. It predicts a very wide range of outcomes for an individual, not just their education success, but their opportunities for employment, their lifetime earnings and their well-being. So it's really important that we get this foundation right for all children. And as I'm sure that you're aware, literacy levels in South Africa are extremely poor when we look at it on a global scale. So in an international assessment of children in grade 4 in 2021, only 81% rather of children in South Africa performed at a level that indicated that they could not read for meaning. So they had very poor reading comprehension, and this situation has not improved in recent years. And as a result of these sorts of findings, there have been many literacy interventions tried out in South Africa. Many of these early grade reading studies begin in grade 1 or above. And for many of them, there's a lack of sort of control group and other types of control that make it quite hard to evaluate their efficacy. And we have very mixed findings from them. So what we did in this project, we were actually taking from the research base that there are very strong foundations of reading that are developed in preschool. So a child's oral language skills, before they even start literacy instruction, are strong predictors of their later reading success. And this has been demonstrated in a range of studies showing that children's preschool oral language skills predict their reading many years later, and that teacher professional development on and how to teach these skills is also very important. But one of the challenges we have that this research has typically been conducted in high-income countries. We need to really understand what can make a difference in a context such as South Africa. And what we do know is that many of the children starting school in South Africa don't actually have these preschool oral language foundations that we know are important for literacy. Many of them are lacking basic alphabet knowledge. They have little access to the sort of environment that can enhance those literacy skills. So what we did in this project was to take the WordWorks Little Stars program, which is designed to develop these preschool skills in order to give children a better start in literacy. And we did a very tight randomized controlled trial to look at the effectiveness of this intervention. So the Little Stars program is a 36-week program targeted for preschool children, and as you've heard, it uses a story-based approach to support the language, skills, and the knowledge that are critical for later reading. So it targets what we call code-related skills, skills that are related to later word reading ability, such as phonological awareness, awareness of the letter sounds in the language. And it targets meaning-related skills that are related to comprehension of text, such as children's knowledge of word meanings and their narrative skills, their knowledge of story structure. And it also has embedded in it professional development and resources for teachers to use in their classroom. So this is just an overview of the activities and their rationale, which are rolled out on a 2-week basis with one book worked on for 2 weeks at a time. There are these language-based skills, teaching children about vocabulary, trying out new words and phrases, developing their narrative skills. Teachers share big books to teach children about print concepts. Children get to create their own little book and to sort of like draw favourite parts of it and to write down keywords. And they also create different objects related to the book, and they listen to the sounds in words. So through this, as you can see in the light blue, these are the sorts of activities that are reinforcing language knowledge, and the activities in green are reinforcing these skills that are important for later word recognition. In terms of feasibility, teachers are given the resources, they're given scripted guides, and they're given regular training to help them to roll out the programme. Also, in terms of feasibility, this has been designed to only take about 15 to 30 minutes a day, so it can be integrated into the daily teaching programme, compatible with different programme structures that might be in place. And the materials are affordable and they're free license to try and make this available to as many people as possible. So this was a rather large study. We had many different objectives, and I'm just going to focus on this final objective in relaying our findings, looking at the effect of this story-based intervention on children's early literacy and language skills and also broader cognitive development. And I'm going to present the findings in 3 parts. We've got skills that were targeted in the intervention, so developing children's phonological skills, developing their language skills. We've also got some language that was directly taught. This was vocabulary directly taught in the programme. And then we also have some measures of broader skills that were not directly targeted or taught, but which might be useful for tracking children's progress. Okay, so we actually had 2 language groups in our study, a group of children, of Isixhosa children, and a group of children speaking Afrikaans, attending their early childhood development centres, and obviously their teachers were also involved. It was a randomised control trial for each language group. So each language group had one intervention group, and it also had a control group who received the intervention at the end of the study. And we selected up to 5 children from each centre. And what we were able to do, as I said, it was very strictly controlled study. So we were actually able to take into account the influence of children's ability at the start of the study on their outcome scores, their time to scores. And then we looked at additional variables that might be associated with these aspects of child development, looking at characteristics of the child and looking at characteristics of the classroom. So in terms of the study assessments, at time 1, so before the children engaged in the Little Works programme, we took measures of their performance, and these were the skills that were directly targeted in the intervention, and also this third category of broader skills that were not directly targeted or taught. So that was before any engagement with the Little Stars program rather. And then we measured children's age, their gender, their height, and their starting vocabulary knowledge using a cross-linguistic task. We also took various measures of the teacher's experience, a measure of classroom environment using a standardized rating scale, and we also had information about school fees, which we took as a proxy for socioeconomic status. And then after the intervention at time 2, we took, again, measures of the skills that were targeted in the intervention, the broader skills that were not directly targeted or taught, and we also took a measure of the vocabulary that had been directly taught in the intervention. Now, I should just here note that there were critical challenges in selecting appropriate measures for these populations, but we selected measures that have been used in the South African context previously, but we're well aware that we don't have a full range of standardized measures that we might have access to if we were conducting this study in a different cultural context. The other thing I should note is that with the vocabulary that was directly taught in the intervention, we only assessed that at the final time point. And that's simply because it would just not be ethical to give these 4- and 5-year-olds a vocabulary test that they would not be able to complete at the start of the study. So we did not administer that assessment then. And we also took, for a subsample of our population, we got information from the caregivers on their home learning environment. Okay, just quickly in terms of the study timeline, this was a study impacted by COVID, so we started the study a little late. We did the basic training, we had our implementation period. And one thing that I should note was that our data collection at time 2 was only 26 weeks into a 36-week program. This was because it was a requirement of our ethical permission that the weight group, the control group, actually had access to the program during that particular school year. So we weren't able to actually assess a full 36-week program. Okay, so as I said, we have 3 different types of outcome measure. We have the skills that were targeted in the programme. So this is children's emergent language and literacy ability, their print and phonological awareness, and their narrative comprehension and production. All of those measures taken before the intervention and also after the intervention. We also have some language that was taught directly in the programme. This was the vocabulary. We only assessed that at time 2. And then we also have this third category of measures that were broader skills that were not directly targeted or taught. And these were taken from the ELOM, the Early Learning Outcomes Measure. And I'm only going to talk about the total score, the analysis of the total scores in this presentation. So I think for the purposes of this, I'm going to skip through the detail about these assessments, but basically for those targeted by the programme, we looked at emergent language and literacy using the subscale from the ELOM. We looked at children's print and phonological awareness using a measure that has been developed at Stellenbosch University, so concepts of print and children's ability to synthesize and identify sounds in words. And we also looked at children's narrative skills, their ability to produce a narrative and their ability to understand a narrative, taken from a culturally sensitive cross-linguistic measure that has been used in many different language samples. As I said, we had vocabulary that was taught in the programme, looking at children's ability to produce and understand words that were in the Little Stars books that they that they engaged with during the programme. And then we had these broader skills, looking at the ELOM measures. And as I said, I'm only going to talk about the total scores here. So what we did in our analysis plan that I'm going to present here, we did a complete case approach. And I would say one of the challenges with this study was that there was a fair bit of missing data from both child absence and also some of the teacher variables. But what we did, the way we did our particular modelling to look at the effectiveness of the intervention, we did different analyses to look at all of the different skills that we've targeted. Or all of the different skills that we measured. So we had the skills that were targeted in the programme, we had the language that was directly taught in the programme, and we also had these broad skills. And what we did in order to predict time to performance, so after 26 weeks of the programme, we first of all looked to see how your ability at time one before engagement with the programme had an impact on performance, and also implementation quality. So whether you were in the control group or the intervention group, and additionally, how well, if you were in the implementation group, your teacher implemented that programme and engaged the children with the activities. That was assessed through observation partway through the study. So that's quite a tight control, because we know that initial ability is typically going to explain your performance on a similar measure several weeks later. Then what we did, we took into account some variables, some measures from the child that we know often predict language and literacy skills. So we looked at children's initial vocabulary using a cross-linguistic vocabulary test. We looked at that age, which can be a strong predictor of ability in early childhood, and also children's gender. And I will say at this point that age and gender were not significant, unique predictors of children's outcomes in this study. And what we did in our the way we did our analysis, only significant variables were selected and included into the next step. So we've looked at child's initial ability and implementation quality. We've then looked at these child level variables that often predict performance. And I'll just skip through those in the interests of time. And then what we did, we looked to see what was going on in the classroom outside of implementation quality. We looked at the teacher's experience, we looked at a measure of general classroom quality, looking at the resources there, and also school fees, to see if these made a difference to children's progress on our key measures. And then finally, what we were able to do was to look at variation between these different classes that we may not have captured in our measures, because all of these children were embedded in groups of sort of 4 to 6 in these different learning centres. So seeing whether there were any other differences that might explain performance. So the analysis I'm going to present has got our 2 language groups. And as I said, this is a complete case analysis. So these are children for whom we had complete data. One, the Issyclosa group, and also the Afrikaans. And I'm sure you want to know what we found. I'm going to take you through the 2 language groups separately. First of all, the Issyclosa language group, and then the Afrikaans, and you'll see there's slightly different patterns of performance. So what did we find in terms of the skills that were targeted in the programme? We had emergent language and literacy, print and phonological awareness, and narrative production and comprehension. Well, first of all, it may be no surprise that whether you're in the intervention group or the control group, children improved over time. What we have here is the actual scores for the emergent language and literacy scale, and then we've got factor scores for the print and phonological awareness and the narrative, because we had multiple indicators. But you will see that both groups made progress over time, which is good to know. What did we find in terms of the variables that actually predicted those time to outcome scores? So what this is, I'm going to just take you through this analysis. Basically, the higher the bar, the more variation, the stronger the prediction, the more variation in performance that was explained. And what you can see, if we just look at children's time 1 emergent language and literacy scores and the implementation quality, it is the time 1, your initial emergent language and literacy, that predicts how well you do on that measure at time 2. Other variables may be related to performance, as we looked at in our modelling, but these did not explain significant variation in children's time 2 emergent language and literacy scores when we took all of these other measures into account. So what we're finding here, regardless of the intervention, it is time 1 emergent language and literacy scores that are predicting your performance on this measure 26 weeks later. So your initial ability is really important. And we find a very similar picture for our different measures. So for print and phonological awareness, here is actually the final model that also takes the classroom into account, but the significant predictors are the time 1 print and phonological awareness scores, and also some variation between the classrooms that we didn't capture by our measures of teacher experience, classroom quality, or SES. But it's, again, this time 1 performance that is particularly strongly predictive. We have a very similar pattern for narrative skills again, or time 1 narrative skills were the only unique significant predictor of how well the It's a Closer Language group did 26 weeks later on the same narrative measure. What about the language that was directly taught in the programme? So here we've got the vocabulary only taken at time 2. And here we get a different pattern. We find that children's baseline vocabulary, which is a different measure of vocabulary knowledge, but also implementation quality. So the children who were enrolled in the intervention group did better than the controls, and those whose teachers demonstrated greater fidelity to the activities did even better. So we have your baseline vocabulary skills, but also the intervention making an impact on skills that are directly taught in the intervention. And what about these broader skills that were not directly targeted or taught? So here we've got the ELOM total scores. Again, like with all of these other measures, children get better over time, as you would expect. But again, what happens when we take those controls into account to look at time 2 performance? And here, as we had for the emergent language and literacy, and as we had for the narrative skills, time 1 initial ability is the strong predictor here. So children's total score on the ELOM at time 1 was the strongest. It was the only unique predictor of their time 2 scores. Now, as you're probably aware, with the ELOM, you can also look at these cut scores to actually look and see whether children are on track, falling behind or far behind across time. So I thought it would be useful for you to see these as well. And as you can see, over time, all children, or both groups, the intervention and the control, have a greater proportion of children who are seen to be on track at time 2, but there's a particularly strong increase for children in the intervention group. So by the end of the study, a greater proportion of those children are on track for their educational learning. So just to summarise the findings for this language group, time 1 ability is the significant predictor of time 2 performance. It was the sole significant predictor for emergent language and literacy, for narrative skills, and the ELOM total scores, and we found that for both groups. It was also a significant predictor for print and phonological awareness, but some classroom factors also had an impact on children's progress. We found that in terms of the intervention, that the implementation quality predicted scores for vocabulary that was directly taught in the programme. And this is a very strong test because it was in addition to their initial vocabulary ability. And then finally, although we took many measures of classroom quality and teacher experience, for this language group, we weren't able to capture all of the important differences between classrooms because we found that these different classrooms differed in terms of their impact on children's print and phonological awareness in some way that we didn't capture. and we're still thinking about what that might be. So that's the summary of the Isixhosa language group. I'll now take you through the same set of results for the Afrikaans children. And what I should say is for this group, we have a slightly different pattern of performance. We find that it's not just initial language ability, but also more that is going on in the classroom, specifically with teacher experience and also their baseline vocabulary that is making a difference to their progress. So just as we had, first of all, with the other language group, the good news is over time, whether you're in an intervention group or in a control group, children who are engaging in an early childhood classroom are progressing and making a difference. Looking first at skills that were targeted in the programme but not directly taught, if we look at the emergent language and literacy scores, here we find that it is the initial vocabulary that is making a significant difference, and also something going on in the classroom that is very puzzling, because we actually had a negative prediction of our observations of classroom quality, suggesting one interpretation is that children in the better resourced classrooms actually made less progress. But the strongest predictor here is initial language ability assessed with the cross-linguistic test. What we find for the print and phonological awareness is that we have your initial print and phonological awareness is an important predictor of your outcomes. Also, the teacher experience is a positive predictor, making a difference. But again, we have that puzzling finding of our measure of classroom quality is actually having a negative rather than a positive effect on outcomes. But the strongest predictor here, again, is initial ability. When we look at children's narrative skills, the critical predictors are initial vocabulary, so initial language skills. Your initial narrative skills also make a difference, and then some random variation between our classrooms that wasn't captured with the measures that we'd used in this study. When we look at vocabulary that was directly taught in the programme, here we have the same finding that we have for the Isixhosa group. Your baseline vocabulary makes a difference, but also being part of this intervention. Children who were in the intervention made more progress or had better outcome scores than those in the control groups, and the quality of implementation of the programme also made a difference. And then when we look at the ELOM total scores, again, children made progress. And what we found here was that the intervention, again, also had an impact. So in addition to children's initial ELOM total scores, we found that children who were in the intervention that was not directly targeting these skills actually made better progress. Also, children who had better baseline vocabulary made better progress, and also the teacher experience had a positive impact on children's total time to ELOM scores. And you can see here I've mapped out again this graphic to show you these cut scores. You can see that across time, both the intervention group and the control group did improve, in that we find a greater proportion of children are now on track after 26 weeks. The intervention group in the Afrikaans sample started off with a lower proportion of children and actually therefore made more progress. So just to summarise the key points from the Afrikaans language group, we found again that time 1 ability is a significant, unique predictor of time 2 performance for all of the measures except the emergent language and literacy. So what children go into an early classroom with, those skills that they're bringing from their kind of like initial first few years of life are making a difference to how well they progress over time. We also found, in addition to that, the initial vocabulary, so not the specific measure of an outcome variable, but just your general language skills are also significant predictors of how well you do over time. So again, what you're bringing into that classroom is making a difference. And as for the Isoclosa children, we found that the implementation had a direct benefit on the vocabulary that was embedded in the intervention. So the intervention group had better performance on the taught vocabulary. And we also found that the intervention made a difference for these broader skills because it impacted on how much progress children made for the ELOM total scores. And again, for this particular group, we were able to capture some, but not all of the important differences between classrooms that are making an impact on children's development. So we found that teacher experience was a unique and positive predictor of children's print and phonological awareness, and also the ELOM total. There was some variation that we weren't able to capture that had a positive impact for narrative skills. And then, as I said, this negative finding that children who were in better resourced classrooms actually made less progress on emergent language and literacy and early print and phonological awareness. Okay, so to wrap up now, I've got some summary points and then some sort of questions that we'd like to throw out to you in the audience. So first of all, what did we find? Well, we found a positive impact of the Little Stars intervention on the language that was directly taught in the programme. The intervention group had higher scores than the controls on the proximal vocabulary test, the time to vocabulary test, and we found this for both language groups. So the Little Stars intervention makes a difference. The implementation quality was a significant unique predictor. We also found that across all of these different measures, initial performance at the start of the study is a very strong predictor of outcomes. It was a unique predictor of time to scores for all of the measures that we took for the Isoclosa language group and for 3 of the 4 time to scores for the Afrikaans language group. So regardless of intervention or other classroom factors, initial ability is important. As I said, age and gender did not predict significant unique variance in outcomes for either language group. And we found that for the Afrikaans children only, that there were classroom covariates that made a real difference. So teacher experience was important in terms of development on print and phonological awareness, and also the ELOM total scores, regardless of whether you were in the intervention or control group. And something about the classroom quality, which was a resource-heavy measure taken from the ECHAs, that seemed to have a negative impact. So children in better resource classrooms appeared to make less progress, and we're still looking into that. And what have we learned? Well, we know that preschool interventions with good resources and teacher training can make a difference. This was a very strong, robust, and very conservative test of this intervention using an RCT that took initial ability into account, because we know that children are always going to develop over time. We were also able to confirm the reliability and sensitivity of several of these measures. As I said, we don't have like kind of a full battery of standardized tests to hand across all of these different language groups that are sensitive to both linguistic differences and cultural differences. We found that all of our different indicators of narrative, print and phonological awareness and vocabulary were coherent structures. And we've also demonstrated the value of using proximal assessments as in the taught vocabulary that are very close to programme content. We've also learnt that it is possible, but it's also challenging to run an RCT in this context. So although we were able to recruit and train sufficient teachers, we had a lot of missing data. There are a lot of child absences as well, particularly for the Isoclosa group in the winter months, partly due to financial reasons reported from the families to save on school fees. So those children had less dosage, and that may be one of the reasons why we've actually found less of an impact on that group than for the Afrikaans children. And as I said, we weren't able to do a full evaluation of the programme because for ethical reasons, we had to allow the control group access to the programme, and it meant that we had to do assessments after 26 weeks of the programme and not 36. So what do we need to do next? Well, one of the things we've got to do, we've really got to understand what explains ability for children who are starting out. We have these, and we're not quite sure why, but we know that initial ability is really making a difference. At the moment, we, in terms of looking at children's initial starting ability, we do not have strong prediction from either the home learning environment or looking at height for age. So we need to understand what we need to do actually in the very early years to give children a good start. We also need to understand better how to capture variability in a preschool classroom and how to measure that quality. We use the early childhood rating scales, which has been used in multiple contexts, but that wasn't capturing all of the variation that we needed. And I think what we need to do is we need to encourage many more randomized controlled trials that are actually testing the effectiveness of interventions in the real world. This was not run by trained research assistants. It wasn't a research team who were implementing the intervention. These were teachers who were trained, who were given the resources. And as we've demonstrated, they were actually able to make a difference in their classrooms through this training. But it's really, really important, I would argue, that you have a control group to actually evaluate the effectiveness. Because as we saw, even the control group saw this increase in children obtaining the on-track ELOM total scores at time 2, which is also a very positive message because it demonstrates that being in this kind of environment, whether you're in the intervention that we were evaluating or not, is actually making a difference to those children. Okay, so I'm very well aware that we've whizzed through that, but I hope you've got the highlights of the findings, and I hope I've left sufficient time that we can listen to your questions and your insights so we can take this work forwards. And I've just given a summary of where you can find additional materials and dissemination as we roll out on this project. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. That was extraordinary to listen to it. We've also, I'm glad that, thank you, Liz Biney, for putting the link to all those really well thought through learning briefs so that they're in the chat, so people really encourage you to download those and engage with those. But Kate, I'm going to ask Heather Barkey to ask the first question. Heather, I wondered, I know that if you could be very brief and just maybe repeat it, I'd rather hear you do it than me. Or should
Okay.
let me just oh, there we go.
Finally found my audio. I'm just not sure if I understood it correctly, but it seemed like the intervention group and the control group, in the intervention group, many of the time 1 scores were lower than for the control group. And I wondered if it was because teachers were choosing children who maybe they thought needed more support. Or did I read that correctly?
No, the children, that's a very important point. Thank you for raising that. The children were selected at random. It was a randomized controlled trial. So we actually, the intervention within each of the intervention classrooms, which were selected at random, a random group of children was selected from that classroom. So the teachers weren't able to identify children who may have benefited, who may have needed to have benefited more.
Thank you, Kate and Heather. There's one question that both Magali and Jane Coombe have regarding what teacher experience is meant. What do you mean by teacher experience? Is it the number of years spent teaching or not?
Yes, sorry, very good question, something that I whizzed over. So the teacher experience, there were 3 different variables that we used to create a factor score for teacher experience. So one was the number of years teaching, one was the teacher age, and one was teacher qualifications. And they were all like kind of very highly correlated, and they formed a single factor score. So it wasn't just experience, but qualification, which did differ across teachers, had an impact. I don't know if Shelley would like to add in anything additional to that. I should be aware that I have like kind of two other members of the team in the audience who are able to bring in additional detail if we need it.
Shelley, otherwise let me carry on, because there are
Let's
a number of great questions. Megan Blair, you had a question. I wondered if you just unmute yourself and ask it quickly. We do it. Are you worried about sample size or power due to the lack of the balance on the initial ability between treatment and control?
So initially the study was very highly powered. We still have sufficient sensitivity and power to detect these differences. I think statistical power is always a challenge in these studies, but the approach that we've taken to the data modeling does enable us to sort of like capture those differences.
Okay, super. And then Shanda, could you unmute yourself? You've got a question about POSA. Let me read it. Seeing that in isiXhosa there is an improvement as well as on language immersion for the control group, just as there's an improvement for those under intervention, how then do we conclude that the intervention is the one that influenced the progress? Do we look at the degree or the extent of the improvement? I hope
Okay, so
that.
In the modeling, in the data analysis approach that we've taken, we are looking at the extent of improvement because we're taking time one ability into account in our analyses. I think it's very encouraging and important that both of the intervention and control groups make a difference over time, because these are quality environments they're in. It's just one of them had this additional particular program that we were testing the effectiveness of. Sorry, I think I've forgotten the rest of the question. Is this written?
It is written in the chat. Shanda, maybe if you want to chip in here.
The other thing, you're asking us to contrast the two different language groups. Is that also part of this question? And because we didn't analyze the two language groups together, and we don't think it would be appropriate to do that because they're coming from different cultural contexts. The language structures are different, which makes it certainly very different in terms of sort of like phonological awareness skills. And so we felt it was important to look at those two language groups separately, because there's so much variation just within a language group. It then becomes really difficult looking at it across those two groups.
Super. Okay, thank you. I'm just going to ask, Svetlana is helping unmute people as we go. So Grace, I wondered if you could start, and then Magali, I know you've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So let's do Grace, if you wanted to talk, and then over to you, Magali.
Just checking, can people hear me?
Yes.
Great. Kate, I was interested to hear that there was information captured about dosage. In specific, you mentioned that there was some absenteeism in the isiXhosa intervention group during the winter months. And I just wonder, having information like that can really help look at the marginal effects of time on task. So was there any research, or could there be any research done on just in that intervention group, or for all of the children, the differing effects based on the amount of dosage that they received? Because this can show you sort of marginal effects. It can show you the impact of high dosage versus low dosage. Can really help you to tease out your effects.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Unfortunately, the information we have about dosage was not captured systematically, so we cannot actually use that as a variable. This was something that was reported to us, and I think Shelley certainly has more information on that. I think there's a request that she's asking that she could be unmuted, and she may be able to talk more about that. But I agree with you, it's very important that we capture this kind of information, not just when testing the effectiveness of an intervention, but just testing the effectiveness of these environments in general. Shelley, have you got anything that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, just to agree with the points that are raised, it was certainly something in another study would definitely have recommended. It's just very resource intensive, and where we could, we did follow where teachers were keeping registers where these were accessible, but yeah, these records are very difficult to get with any level of accuracy and consistency from some of the centers. So we definitely we sampled some of the registers, and certainly the trends were that attendance was somewhat erratic, obviously just normal children missing a day or two here and there, but certainly in the July school holidays, particularly in the sample of children from Khayelitsha, the attendance really dropped, and that was consistent across the samples, the registers we sampled. So I think and also this was reported by the trainers and the teachers. So either children were going back to Eastern Cape for the holidays, or they were staying at home with their older siblings who were on school holidays. So we are fairly sure that the dosage, apart from normal variations, was much lower in the isiXhosa language group, who probably missed 3 to 4 weeks of that July holiday school period.
Thank you, Shelley. I wondered if Magali could ask, she's got a couple of questions. Magali, would you like to ask your most pressing one?
Yes, thanks. I was really trying to wrap my head around the finding for the isiXhosa group, that the time 1 scores are found to be the unique or the best predictors of the time 2 scores. In other words, it seems that the intervention itself, or the quality of the intervention, wasn't really able to. Well, I'm just wondering if I'm understanding this correctly. Does that mean that the intervention wasn't really able to bring the children who were maybe the most at risk to bring them to a place where they could catch up, or is that not a valid conclusion to draw from this finding?
It's a very fair question to ask. So I think, and it's very nuanced. So when we look at the direct skills, so we look at the vocabulary that was directly taught, that language group were impacted by the intervention. So the intervention made a difference for the language that was directly taught in the intervention. And we find this in RCT studies that actually take baseline scores, time 1 scores into account, we typically find wherever we look across the globe, time 1 is always going to predict what you come into an intervention with is partly going to predict what you come out with. The intervention was not directly teaching the emergent language and literacy, the narrative skills, or the print and phonological awareness assessments that we assessed with those other measures for that group. And we often find that when we scale up and look at the effectiveness of an intervention using an RCT, that this is found like kind of across the globe in high income as well as low income families. And remember, this is a 26-week program. One of the things I think that is of interest that we need to think about with this sample is if you look at the ELOM total scores and how they changed over time, and then we get kind of a higher proportion of children in both language groups in the intervention group who are actually now classed as being on track. So some of what the intervention might have been doing is actually laying those foundations to be on track for learning and teaching. I mean, we've also got to recognise that what is now often recommended for intervention studies is you don't actually look at the effects in the first year that the teacher is teaching that intervention, because they're learning a lot about like the theory and about teaching as well. And actually you can often find stronger effects when you look at that teacher with a new group of children, but when they're delivering that intervention that they really know well in the second year. So I actually think this is a really, given this challenging context and given what the children were going into the study with, the fact that we actually found an impact of the intervention on the vocabulary that was taught in the intervention for both of these groups, who were coming in with very, very low scores on many of these measures indeed, I think is very significant. And actually seeing the development of these skills over time, although not necessarily impacted by the intervention, both of these children were in sort of like, you know, high quality preschool settings. It's just one also had the Little Stars program, but others may have had other things. And I think, Shelley, I don't know if you have any more information and would like to sort of comment on what was going on in the control classrooms.
Yeah, I think I put in the chat if people had seen, or maybe not seen, but we, in recruiting these ECD centres and the practitioners for the study, we worked very closely with the Insaber Trust in Paarl, Wellington area, and in Kalita with Sekule Sonke. And these practitioners were part of a network of ECD centres that were being supported by these NGOs and organisations. Some had been supported, some were newly recruited into their network. So I think this is we are obviously comparing and asking whether adding in and including the Little Stars program strengthens their learning and teaching over and above what the existing offering is. So yeah, I mean, I think it does speak to the fact that the children are improving as a result of the inputs through the classroom and through the support of these NGOs in these spaces, which I think is consistent with other findings in South Africa. So yeah, I think we didn't expect them not to improve. They were getting older, they were in a centre, the centres were being supported by NGOs. It was just, the question was, can we add value through this program? And I think, yeah, given the shorter timeframes and some of the levels of absenteeism which did reduce dosage, and certainly as Kate pointed out, although in a separate paper the teacher take-up was very positive, both in terms of their reported feedback on their use of the program, as well as our trainers who visited each of the centres, there was high uptake and strong uptake in both language groups. But obviously this is a new program that's being integrated into their existing daily program. So yeah, I think as Kate pointed out, once this is more settled, I think it's a daily activity. So we also know that teachers are going to use some of the activities more than others, and over time they're going to use this more and more as they build confidence. So it is an interesting point to make, that is it better to evaluate child level outcomes in the second year of the program. So good point.
Thank you, Shelley. Jane Oakhill wants to address, Frank put a very interesting comment in the Q&A box. Jane, I wondered if you wanted to unmute it. He's asking about the fact that DBE's introduced the use of mother tongue as a medium of instruction in grade 4 from this year. Where does that put South Africa? Jane, over to you.
Yeah, I thought that was it. It's a much broader issue that our project didn't address, but I think this is a really, really important issue. I don't know where the 81% statistic comes from, but that is very worrying, isn't it? And I think that the issue here is something that is happening in many languages, but perhaps is more marked in South Africa because of the variety of different languages that children are exposed to. But this issue about moving from reading to comprehension is absolutely crucial. I mean, this is an issue in
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, thank you. We've actually run out of time, and there is such flurry of interesting questions in the chat. I feel loath to stop us, but I do have to. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to Kate. The final thing was whether there's anonymized data available for any sort of secondary analysis that everyone's wanting to dive into. Perhaps, Kate, you could just let us know if there is and if there's a time frame involved for that.
So at the moment we're still analysing this data set for dissemination, but we will be making obviously anonymised data sets that we've analysed publicly available, so people would be able to access that. If anybody is interested in exploring any particular questions in this research data set, then just get in touch with us. We're happy to collaborate and to share.
Fantastic. Jane, thank you. Kate, thank you. Thank you, Jane and Shelley, for also chipping in. And thank you to everyone for a very, very engaging webinar at 11 o'clock on a Wednesday. We'll look forward to meeting again on the 2nd of July. We have a very exciting seminar planned. More information of that will you find. But basically, it's a webinar by Camille Wittersale. I hope I pronounced her name correctly, from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, looking at vaccine coverage in the Eastern Cape. But look forward to engaging then. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.